All right, welcome to our fourth episode of The Bleed, it's Bleeding Cool's comic book reading group. Today we are joined by the wonderful writer Ales Kot, and we'll be talking about Ray Fawkes' The People Inside. We're also joined by a good friend of mine, Sam Morse, who's joining us from the Google campus in San Francisco. So I guess to start off, Ales, tell us a little bit about yourself. What's been going on with you? What are you working on?
Um, well, I'm the greatest living comics creator under 30. Uh,
And so modest.
I'm just, did I get that right? Is it under 30 or under 40? I'm not sure. That's okay. Who cares? Anyway, hi everyone. I make comics, film, TV, whatever I feel like, sort of, I guess, also for a living, and it actually is working out really well, and it has been for a while. Um, So actually saying sort of for a living is complete bullshit. I love doing it for a living, and I love doing it exactly the way I want, and somehow I'm getting better and better at it as far as I'm concerned, so I'm just having a great time. And right now I'm working on about how many things? I finished something like 4 scripts in the past 5 days, so I'm just lying on bed right now, basically. Not even joking. I'm actually lying on bed. The great thing about me not having my camera turned on right now is that I could be getting a blowjob for all you know, and
You could be. Is this a little hint as to what's actually happening in the life of Alice right now?
there's yeah, my life.
To be fair, we all could be getting blowjobs right
It's
now.
true.
Hey, at least
I'm not
I am.
you can hear in sentence. Uh, and yeah, I'm working on Zero, which is spy deconstructionist spy series, I guess, would be one way to put it. Another would be a speculative fiction headfuck. Another would be, I don't know. People use various terms. It's basically my way of looking at all the super agent and secret agent mythological stuff and saying, hey, why don't I do something with this? But why don't I do something that genuinely interests me and without worrying whether I'm going to reach a certain amount of people or not? Just do it the right way. Because I really don't like to think in terms of satisfying an audience. I like to think in terms of satisfying myself because I'm really the only person I actually can accurately ascertain what I will like in a comic. So I sort of feel like I always write for the audience of one. And we're on what? We're on volume two. Actually, just came out today, which is a bit of serendipity because I swear I did not plan this so perfectly that I would just come out today. But maybe it occurred to me before, but definitely not when we were talking about it originally. But it's nice. Yes, volume two out now. Buy it. Or don't. I don't care. I love you anyway. Um, it's great. It's my exploration of the war meme and spy meme and how violence works and how it permeates our existence and what can we do with it and what can we do about it and so on. Besides that, I'm writing Secret Avengers at Marvel, which is sort of the farcical side, the tragic angle of Zero. Not that they are continuously one or the other, they merge in strange directions and so on, but yeah, I would say that Secret Avengers is more overtly farcical. And I also write Winter Soldier, which is starting to come out October 1st from Marvel, and that's the culmination of what I call the war trilogy that I'm doing, and that's after that happens, I'm gonna be writing about sex and love way more than about war, which is gonna be interesting because that's something that doesn't often happen in comics, and at least not as far as I can tell. And I think in general it might have something to do with the fact that um, American culture and often Western culture in general promotes war and violence, but is actually afraid of nudity and sex.
Hmm.
And when you have that in the culture, you sort of end up with so the culture that promotes death as opposed to life, which to me is sort of backwards. Like I think that death is a part of life and that's completely natural, but I prefer the whole deal. And that's what I'm working on. That's where my headspace sort of is right now.
Hmm.
And I'm working on a
Interesting.
lot of things I haven't told you about that are not announced yet.
Well, if you would like to tell us about it, we'd be happy to hear it. New announcements on air. Well, that's great. It sounds like you got a lot on your plate right now. Are you still working on the Zero pilot too?
On what?
The Zero pilot for the show?
Well, the Zero Pilot and the Zero TV Bible, which I both wrote, are done, and they are. I mean, the series is in active development, which is the sort of fluid state that can signify a lot of different things. But I can definitely say with a wide smile and happy eyes that we're in a good place, and I'm really working on it.
Well, that's very exciting. Do you have any other? You working on any writing projects outside of comics too? You don't have to tell us specifically. I'm just curious if there's anything.
Yeah, there's a couple movies.
Cool. Well, that's exciting. Well, good for you, man. Congratulations on the success. It seems like all your books are having a decent response. I know Zero, at least at the shop that I work at. Oh, yeah, Alice, I work for Leaf now. I don't know if you
you work
remember.
for Edition Comics. Oh, I love that story. Yeah, I've been there a few times, and I've even done plannings there.
Yeah,
But I have to say, I showed Dave that comic book shop, so he can take all the credit
it's true.
here.
It's true. It was one of the first places we came when I moved out here. But it sells really well at our store. At least it's really popular with our client base, which is nice. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. I heard that is the most selling comic in some comic book store in Washington, D.C., because all the think tank people go to buy
Oh,
it
really?
supposedly.
Nice.
I'm pretty amused by that. I did that last week, and I went, "Oh wow, that's pretty hilarious."
Wait, do you know which comic shop it was? I was actually living in D.C. last year.
I forget.
That's hilarious, and it makes perfect sense. All right. Well, anyway, let's delve into the people inside. By Ray Fawkes, published by Oni Press, I believe. Sort of his follow-up to his previous graphic novel, One Soul, which I haven't actually read. Now that I've read The People Inside, I really want to read One Soul. I guess I just want to hear from you guys. What was your sort of initial impression? Sam, why don't we start with you? What did you think when you first read through this?
Yeah, for me it was interesting. When I was reading it, I think it took a little while to get momentum going, and because of the unique format, having each different cell be a different story in and of itself on each page, it took a while for me to catch on. Once I did catch on, it took a little while for me to start to remember all the different stories. But once I did, and kind of that momentum was fully moving, I thought it was really, really, really excellent. I found myself relating particularly with some of the different stories more than others. But overall, I thought it was a really, really cool look at love, the different types of love, how love, there's no two types of love that are the same. Kind of is one of the things I took from it. And also on the flip side, death as well, because I think death plays a big part in the story. As certain characters die off, you have the cells go black, so to speak. So I thought it was really powerful, and more emotionally powerful than in a lot of comic books or books generally that I read. So I enjoyed it quite a bit.
Interesting. What about you, Joe?
Well, I have never really read any of Ray Fawkes' work, any of the mainstream stuff that he does for DC Comics, and I'd heard a lot about One Soul, so I was really curious about this one, and I was kind of apprehensive just because I heard it was a spiritual successor to One Soul, and I was, worried, oh, am I going to be lost? The continuity comic freak inside of me was a little, apprehensive, but it was it was entertaining. It was thoughtful. You can tell the amount of work and the amount of just care that is given to each panel and each character and each scene, and not just that, but the descriptions in it are really great. There's no dialogue bubbles, there's no thought bubbles. It's all just narration, and it just really goes a long way and to show that as long as you have an idea that really that you can bring it out on the page, it doesn't have to be dressed up. It can be as simple and as elegant as this, and it works to just as great of an effect. I really enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Well, Alish, how about you? This was actually your pick, and why? Why'd you pick this?
It was my pick because I think it's one of the, well, I don't even think, I believe that it's one of the best graphic novels in terms of pure emotional impact. It's one of the most impactful graphic novels that I've ever read.
Mm-hmm.
It's also pushing the medium forward in ways that I have not seen in such a concentrated form in a comic book in a long time, maybe more than a decade. If we're talking about concentration and the density, graphic novel is totally unafraid to trust the reader, and I don't mean that just in terms of emotional intelligence. I mean, the other way around, actually. I should say it the other way. In terms of logical intelligence, meaning making sense of what you're seeing through your brain, but also emotional intelligence, meaning through your heart. Because as I started reading it, I very quickly realized that there was a switch for me, and this realization that I often have and try to also work with, that says that we actually understand and process things way faster than we think we do. When I approach things by pure feeling, I can often catch many strands of things happening at once and feel them differently. It's sort of as if time would be slowing down, which is actually a good way of describing what's happening in every page of the comic. It's about time being frozen and you moving between it at your own choice. It's sort of like perceiving large chunks of the world all in the same moment and moving between them and having this pattern recognition that even when you're not connecting logically, oh, this panel and the panel on the previous page belongs to the same two people because there's about how many, 12 or 18 stories happening at least. You feel that there's connectivity. You might not immediately logically go into, oh, snap, this means that these people are doing this, but you have the feeling, and the feeling carries you somewhere already, and that's really important. And I find it rare that I see that done in comics so well.
Yeah.
Just sort of that pure emotional ride, is that what you mean? That you don't see in comics?
Both, actually. I don't see creators trusting readers as much as I would like to, but that might say nothing about the creators and much more about myself. Maybe I should just be more vigilant about trusting myself as a creator and therefore trusting the reader too. And actually, that's something. If that's true, then I'm on a good way because I'm pretty much doing and trying to do that constantly. I do feel like there's a lot of room for going further with that, as far as I am concerned. And seeing something like that being created is inspiring to me as a creator, too.
All right, cool. Well, so I have another question, actually. Now, the way that the book presents all of the different stories that are going on within it, each sort of couple, for lack of a better term, has its own little square, and each page is divided into 6. So there's 12 stories happening all simultaneously, and they sort of split and come together as things progress. But it makes for a very different and interesting reading experience. And I sort of read it 2 different ways, and I'm curious with you guys about how you approached the actual reading of this story.
Yeah, I have something, and this ties into what Alice was saying. Alice, you're saying that like there's somehow when you're reading this, you kind of start to sense a pattern, and you said this switch flipped for you. For me, a big part of that was the prose. While each story was different, the prose were very poetic in how they flowed from panel to panel. And something I noticed as well is that there wasn't any, or I don't think so, any punctuation. So it added more kind of that poetic element, that flow, and it also kind of made me think like, is this narration? Is this the person's thought within the panel? What is he trying to say with this? Just tie the stories together when there wasn't necessarily a connection between 2 panels next to each other, and to also help it kind of drive the emotional impact of the story home, to both visually and as you read. So I thought that was a really powerful way that he delivered the emotional aspect of it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It was interesting, like his choice to sort of write this almost as a poem, sort of like a visual graphic poem in a way, and it's very well done. But did you read it like as if you as if you're reading a normal comic, or did you read it like one story at a time?
I sat down and once I realized how the format and the structure was, I realized I could read this in 2 ways. I kind of made a decision that, you know what, I personally think there's no right way to read a comic, but for myself, I felt like it would detract from the experience if I did read a panel, flip the page, read a panel, flip the page, read a panel. Especially because of the prose and how the prose flow. I thought it was meant to be read continually, not flip the page. So kind of maybe as you would a traditional comic.
How about you, Alice?
I read it by combining the techniques, because the beautiful thing about comics to me, and the thing that's practically exclusive to them as an art form, is that we can move through them. We can move through them in all the ways. We can flip the page back and forth. We're completely in control of how time flows in the comic. And that's because of the empty panel spaces between the panels, and also because of the empty spaces between the pages. Because those empty spaces are our imagination, and whatever happens there is completely different for each person and each individual ever. So I went and I started reading it just the classic left to right way, and then I started occasionally skipping back and double checking something at the beginning, because I thought, do I have this right? Am I connected? In some ways, abandoning that approach. In some ways, oh wow, I feel like this echoes this part. I want to take a look back and I want to read it, or I want to read this entire part just in sequence, one panel on that page, one panel on this page, because I already read through it one way and now I want to do it the other way. So I sort of played with it, and I feel like it's a graphic novel that really invites that playfulness, which to me is crucial to life. I want that from any experience. I want to be impressed, and I want to have a sense of adventure in what I'm doing, and it's exactly like that. It's an experience that tells me, hey, come back. There's more to me than you can ever actually grasp. It changes. I bet the second time, the third time, the fourth time, each time I will look at this, it's going to be a completely different book. That's beautiful.
I have to echo that sentiment 110%. I think most days, these days, and and when you are so inundated with, with a medium that you like, you kind of understand the conventions and the tropes and the devices that they use, and you get used to page turn reveals and things like that, the action dictating a way you're supposed to read, and it was so refreshing to read a complete and fully realized story where the pacing is it's not there. The pacing is in the power of your hands. It's not guided by the way your eyes move across the page. It's there for you to read it as you want. And I started reading it left to right, conventional comic style. But once you get in, once I was like 25 pages into it, it was one of those things where I was constantly going back, going forward, reading whole sections, going back to the beginning of it to see how it all lines up. And you just, I think Alice is right that you find so much more value in it once you go through it, have an idea, and have digested it. And when you go through it again, it's so rewarding. There's just little visual cues where they all add up. There's little emotional cues that feed right into it that go from very disparate elements and storylines and how they feed into each other. It's unlike most comics that are out there, and that's why like I was saying about the pacing, it's kind of great. It's refreshing to read a graphic story, a sequential story where the pacing is like throw it out the window.
Yeah, for me, I started reading it the conventional way, left to right. But as you said, about 25, 30 pages into it, it became difficult to keep the different stories all in my head at once. I felt almost as if I was doing a disservice to each individual story by not giving them sort of the care and individual attention that each of them honestly deserves. And in that way, I'm really attracted to this book because it almost makes you read it in an alternative way, in the same way that you were talking about, Alice, like moving in between, back and forth, doing all these sorts of different styles of absorbing the material. And I think that's one of the book's greatest strengths, is that it almost makes you have to do that, and if you want to really sort of get the full depth of what's going on. Because reading it left to right, you get sort of a little glimpse, but it's difficult to keep them all straight if you're trying to absorb all 12 stories, eventually more, at the same time. And I don't know, I was really impressed by it, and it's just incredibly well done. It really makes you want to read more of Ray Fawkes' stuff. I saw him when I was at the shop. I didn't realize that he was writing a bunch of those DC books. I think he's on like the Batman team with Scott Snyder, and I think he's the guy who's on the Constantine thing, which is really interesting. Neither are books that I would really want to check out, but now that I know that he's on it, it would be interesting to see what he would do on a superhero book.
He's launching a new one with, I think it's Ben Templesmith.
Yeah.
And it's just it's kind of like a spiritual successor to Gotham Central, which we were talking about last week, and it looks really cool. Ben Templesmith is great, but to see him on a book like this, it's kind of like the creator-owned companies are really getting really talented, or not creator-owned, but the work-for-hire companies are really getting really talented auteurs and allowing them to go crazy in their universes, which is really the best thing you can do. And yeah, it is Ray Fawkes. It's Ray Fawkes Gotham by Midnight with Ben Templesmith, the artist of 30 Days a Night. So I'm excited.
Intriguing. Cool.
Yeah, Ray also starting a series at Image. I forget what it's about.
Oh yeah, did you Intersect? Is that what it's called? I can't remember.
I'm fact checking it right now. It is interesting. Yes. Aha! So that'll be coming out this winter, it says. So at least it'll be fun to see some more creator-owned stuff from him. Gotta love the creator-owned stuff.
Now, another question I had, in particular for you, Alice, because with alternative ways of presenting a narrative, jumping around at different points in time, like you do with Zero, and like Ray is doing here with presenting multiple stories at once, merging and separating, it becomes, it seems sort of like a balancing act between the structure of the story and like the story itself. And I'm curious how you, in your work, and how you then view what Ray has done here with the people inside, approaching that balance, between not making it too structurally heavy and too much of a process that takes away from the actual reading experience. It takes away from the narrative that you're trying to tell. What do you think, Alish?
I mean, I try not to think.
Fair enough.
I find that most of the actual creating that I do runs from feeling and not from thinking. When I write most things, I think beforehand, and I think after writing. I think beforehand as in I could, for example, get anything between 50 and 500 pages worth of notes that could be in some cases compiled for a year or two beforehand, even more. And I have bits of dialogue, and I have ideas on what I want to do with the narrative, and I might even have outlines. It varies. I could have all of these things, and I could even lay it out for myself or something, and then I go in. I feel that when I go in, it's like sort of like jumping into the ocean or jumping into a river. More like jumping into a river. Like if you don't want to swim against the river unless you want to just like really exhaust yourself and have to get out fast. I kind of feel like that's against the point of swimming in the river. Like I want to go with it. So if I jump into it or jump into the imagination space or whatever we're gonna call it, I just want to let it sort of take over, and I feel like it's not even necessarily about logically constructing a narrative when I'm writing, but it's about listening to it as it's already happening somewhere. It's at that point there's so much in my subconscious and unconscious that there's a connection established between me and the multiverse or the part of the multiverse where that particular reality is true. Because I feel like there's really no way for me to tell if any particular reality is more or less true than my own. I feel like they all might be simulations, or they might not. I have no idea. So I just give up, or try to figure it out, depending on the day. Often both. But just by looking at it and observing it and typing it all down, it sort of feels like it might be similar to how I feel like I think Ballard said that too, that it's sort of like painting. I feel like I have a painterly approach to how I write. Painterly or like a sculpture. It's like seeing this big block of a rock and having ideas of what's not there, but also having ideas of what's underneath the rock and what the shape could be if I take certain bits off, and then I start revealing more and more of it as the longer I spent with it, and then eventually it's this thing that's in front of me, and I go and I check with myself and I go, okay, so this is how I feel about it. Is it done? If it's not done, let's dissect it. Let's see why it connects. Let's see why it doesn't connect. Not based on some sort of an imaginary reader, except for not even. No, it's really down to myself. I just need to make sure that everything flows right and that everything works and it connects, and there are no logical flaws in the narrative as far as the internal logic of the story goes. Which can also mean that there's no logic whatsoever, but again, depending on the story. And yeah, and then off I go. So it's this combo of knowing when to think and knowing when to feel and knowing what to sort of switch between the two, I feel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you think you see any of that kind of approach mirrored with the people inside?
Well, I don't know what would be a projection and what would be Ray's approach. We haven't talked much about it, but just based on knowing Ray a little bit, meeting him at a convention here and there, spending a few minutes talking, I would definitely say that I feel that he goes by that approach as well, or a similar approach, to say the least. I would feel that this book has been very tightly planned, but also but that he's totally unafraid of diving into the experience and letting it change it. It's sort of like it's there. It's there. Like change is that one constant of the entire book. It's shown past something that's to be glorified or feared. It's shown in life experience as a whole, and I find that really beautiful.
No, in the beginning and in the end, the whole story is kind of framed with the sequence of the leaves, the different leaves, and in their different states. I was interested in you guys. What did you think that those leaves meant as far as being the bookends for the story? They're there for a reason.
Yeah, I feel like I wouldn't like to talk about the ending just because I feel like I don't, if people who haven't read the book yet are going to be listening to it, I would prefer to not give them much of an idea. But as for the beginning, I feel like they just echo on a micro and macro scale, because who says that leaves don't have an amazing life of their own that we know nothing about, but they echo everything that happens within the book. But it's that, to me, it's that. And I'm basing that on not even having to process it by intellect. It's just the constant dance of death and life and fucking and everything in between.
Now, is this a story about love, or is this a story about death?
Can you have one without the other?
Can you?
I'm not sure. I think it's a story. I think it's a story that's about everything. I think it's a story that's about a rare experience that is a mirror. Sort of like, actually, I don't know. Have you seen Tarkovsky's The Mirror, or is it
a part of it? I haven't finished it now.
Yeah, so that's one of those experiences where I feel like Ray did something similar to that. In that it's so open to interpretation that it's fluid. It's fluid in the best way possible. It's sort of like being like entering again. The water metaphor is really apt. Like getting into an ocean and suddenly the ocean just sort of allows you to be in it, and it changes its shape when you're in it. Depending on how immersed in it you are, the change of the outside of the ocean changes too.
I have a question for you guys. I was reading this, I was thinking about how, as we were talking about earlier, being able to flip back and forth, choose how you want to read it, is particularly suited to this kind of comic book format, but graphic novel format. Wondering, Alice, you've written screenplays, everybody here has seen movies, etc. Is this some sort of experience that could be replicated in another type of medium? Film, TV, music, plays, whatever, what have you? I just kind of want to hear everybody's thoughts there, just in general.
I think it could be, but it would be a much different experience. I think there are ways of presenting information in a similar way in other mediums. I don't know if they would be as accessible and as resonant as they are in this. The ability to go back and forth is really important, and the ability to choose how you experience it is a big part of it. And I think if you were to translate that into be it a novel or a film, that sort of aspect of the comics medium is taken away, and because it's taken away, it sort of creates a completely new and different experience and meaning, maybe, behind it. And I wonder, like, if you can even sort of present things similarly, but that like the takeaway would be different than it is in here, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, for sure. I think that it's obviously very different, but music, I think, is maybe for me one of the closest, one of the ways it would be easiest, because you're able to listen to an album, for example, first to last, song to last, and obviously there's a lot of emotional meaning there. You can also, I personally have rearranged listen ways. You listen to a song, you go back to another song because you like how it transitions into the next. So I think music is one medium that obviously it would be a very different experience, but a complementary or similar experience in a way to how you read this book.
Yeah, I think there's strengths and weaknesses for each different medium, and I think some of the best adaptations from prior works are ones that don't try to recreate the same or manufacture that same experience. I think the people, especially behind filmmaking, behind TV adaptations, when people are writing novelizations of stories that are already out, I think that the strongest adaptations come out of just dissecting the material and finding what's important about it and what resonates with people, and finding the themes and finding just the heart of it, and then using the tools that you have in this new medium to not mimic that, but to portray that heart and those themes in a way that would resonate with movie audiences or television audiences, what have you. In music, you make a good point that music is, you kind of have a lot of control as an artist over the way it's interpreted. Even in, I think music has a lot of value to it because you don't know the artist's life story beforehand. You don't know what particular heartbreak or particular pain or particular uplifting moment they experience, and you can prescribe your own value to it. And I think that's I think that it would be lost. I think it would be a really awesome challenge to see talented people adapt this story to a different medium, but I don't think it'd be easy at all. Not at all.
Yeah, I'm curious with Ales, because I mean you've sort of done the adaptation for your own work. What's your perspective on what makes a successful adaptation?
I mean, I don't know what success would mean for anyone else but myself. That's
well, then for you, for like when you were.
That's what I want to talk about. And what was mentioned, there were a few really good things mentioned that are sort of going to help me get there. One is that to be a slave to the idea that the adaptation has to be perfect and perfect in that rigid way where it has to echo everything, that rarely works. It worked with maybe the first Sin City movie, and that's the only instance where I remember it working. And maybe also with the Batman TV show back in the day, but that I don't quite remember if the comic ever got that bonkers. I feel like when really, really talented filmmaker who wants to do right by a novel takes it and transforms it into something else, they inevitably have to take advantage of the medium they're working in, which means that it's not going to be the same thing. And they can transform it in different ways. We can take a look at something like Darren Aronofsky's Requiem for a Dream, which is a fairly adaptation that's fairly close, but in terms of visual dynamics, it doesn't really feel like Selby's writing. It feels much more like more streamlined Burroughs almost, and like Elroy maybe in like these staccato sentences, like the way of cutting, the visual edge of it, and all of that. Then mentioning Burroughs, then there's the other part of part of the equation where you get something like Naked Lunch being adapted by David Cronenberg. And there, Cronenberg, in collaboration with Burroughs back then, just went in a completely different direction that is connected to the book, but it creates a new story around it. And usually, that to me is more interesting. It doesn't that it has to happen every time, but I'm more interested in seeing that. So that's, for example, when I started writing the Zero Pilot, like I never even for a second thought I'm just going to adapt the comic I wrote like one by one. I was just like, hey, I need to make a new story. How do I make a new story that utilizes things that I have done right, but is a new thing? Because when I'm making something, the idea that, let's say, it's going to make me a few $1 million over the next few years, and that therefore I should slave for a year on like writing this thing exactly by the formula of what I've done already, that's me wasting a year of my life, and then I get hit by a bus and I die. Imagine that. That would be so fucking horrible. That would be like, it's not the point of life. I don't know how long I have left. I want to have fun. So I went, hey, I'm going to create something new, and I'm going to have fun with it, and if I do it right, then it's going to work. And, you know, we'll see whether it works or not when and if Zero arrives. But my perception of that is exactly, hey, do whatever feels right, but, as Stanley Kubrick said, take advantage of the medium. Unless there is a reason, and I'm paraphrasing, unless there's a reason for why this has to exist in this particular medium, maybe don't do it. So I can imagine, actually, the people inside working spectacularly well in movie form. But I think that it's a movie form that we haven't quite invented yet. I actually do believe that we're getting there. I do believe that the people inside is one of the many ways we're getting towards new, possibly even a new art form. And it's something that can also be traced in other places. It can be traced in the mashup culture. It can be traced in, again, cut-ups, something that also connects to it. It can be traced to breakcore and IDM music and many, many other places. And, you know, your Twitter stream, for fuck's sake. And so on, and so on. I wonder what Burroughs would think about Twitter. I think that he would be so happy about it. So when I look at that, it's inspiring, and I think, hey, there are ways. There could be. And I think that it's, again, about, if someone would be adapting it, it would have to be about finding the right way to trust the observer as much as Ray trusts them, at least. But also, it might be about the idea that perhaps film might not quite be enough for it. I feel like there's something to be said for more direct participation. Perhaps that's where film is evolving into. Perhaps something else will. Because the comics are really, they are so amazing for learning. There's a reason why comics were used for propaganda so often. That's the combination of words and pictures. And I mean, if we go in detail, all the words are really pictures that we agree upon for the most part. Those combinations are extremely strong, and we just suck them in with our brains. So, and we interact with them in such creative ways in every living moment, almost. It's a book that simultaneously asks to be talked about a lot, and I'm having a blast talking about it with you. And at the same time, it also inspires this complete just shutting up and staring and reading and just being in the moment. And I find that's what the best art experiences do for me. They remind me that I'm alive here and now.
Intriguing. I'm curious. I want to push you a little bit. You said that you see something like this sort of even breaking into what could be considered a new art form. expand on that. I'm curious as what you mean. How do you see a new art form?
Well, I would like my first response to that in my head was ask me in 10 years when I invent it. I mean, I would be lying if I didn't say that I talked about that 5 years ago already. You know, although I remember that I was lying in the living room at 2 in the morning, and a lot of people just gasped and looked at me because they were asking what I want to do with my life, and I just gave them an answer that I seriously meant. So what? What do you want to do with your invent a new art? Oh, yeah, that one. Anyway, there's an intersection of gaming, film, and comics that, and I think this is going to have to a lot to do with how we work with developing artificial intelligence. I like the idea of a story that responds to you and morphs with you. I like the idea of an art form that effectively somehow integrates the users, or not even the users, but the experiencers' life experience, and creates a story that is in some way particularly useful for that person. I think that there would be a lot of ways of using that. I mean, therapeutically, I think it could be absolutely excellent. You know, it could be a way to help people deal with trauma. It could be a way to help kids with learning disabilities get past them. It could be really about anything. I make notes about it, but it's too early to talk about it as anything very concrete. I would suspect that within a few years I'm going to start doing some serious work on it, but until then...
It sounds closer to a video game than it does a film.
It does, in a way. It does, and I think that... it does, but there's something about film... about the immersion that I get in film that I don't often get in a video game. And I think that I think that might have something to do with the atmosphere. It's still very rare that a video game creates atmosphere that swallows you completely, at least. And I kind of feel like if I identify what aspects of good movies do that and what aspects of good video games do that, then the merging could happen.
Virtual reality is something that could, as that technology emerges, something that really could immerse you in a big way.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a part of it. I'm pretty excited about Oculus Rift. Yeah, like that Alien game that I saw for it looks incredible, and from what I've heard, people get really, really freaked out when they
Oh, man.
Yeah, so that's one part. It's funny how we start with those experiences. Like the first experiences are like awe and terror, basically the two basic feelings that Steven Spielberg always, or most of the time, really works with are just awe and terror combined. And then we go somewhere else, and then when it gets on the street, then it gets immediately used in some way for sex, as William Gibson says. It's
good old Gibson.
Things, and it will likely try to fuck it first. Yeah.
Well, I guess, bringing it back to the book, do you see, what are some other books that you've read recently, or they don't even have to be recently, actually, any of you guys, that you would consider to have sort of pushed the medium in such a dramatic way that the people inside does? Are there peers to this book, I guess is another way of answering this question.
Dave, something that I recommended to you, it's a little bit different, but I had a similar experience while reading it, was Embassy Town by Chime.
Mm-hmm.
The way he writes, he doesn't explain anything to you off the bat. He relies on the reader's intelligence to figure everything out as you read.
Mm-hmm.
So it took me about a quarter of the book. I was enjoying it, but before everything clicked, and it really became all the themes and just really the plot and the language he's creating. Everything started to kind of be driven home. So I really recommend Embassy Town by China Mieville. It deals with language and how that informs how we view reality, and a lot of interesting ideas as well beyond that. But really cool book.
Mm-hmm. Other guests? Is there something that you can think of that's sort of related to this?
Sure. What am I reading right now? Oh yeah. I'm really enjoying Rebecca Solnit's A Field Guide to Getting Lost, which I believe that Solnit lives in San Francisco.
Intriguing. A field guide to getting lost, you say?
A Field Guide to Getting Lost. Yeah, and it's exactly about that. It's a book of essays on getting lost and how getting lost, whether it's losing the sense of self or losing the sense of orientation in space in some other way, can prove beneficial and can give you that sense of exactly a sense of awe and all the other feelings that could come with that. And also I'm reading and finishing Joan Didion's Slouching Towards Bedlam, which is another great book of essays from mostly mid-60s, if I remember correctly. I believe so. I think it's her first collection of essays. I read White Album, and I read a couple others of her book, like Salvador. But Slouching Towards Bedlam is very intriguing in that it paints complex portrait of California in that time.
Mm-hmm.
There are essays that range on everything from John Wayne to a murder trial of a housewife who seems to have burned her husband alive in a car, and to Didion's leaving of New York and moving to California to, among other things, co-write movies with her husband. One of them, for example, was Panic in the Needle Park, which was, I believe, the first Al Pacino movie.
Interesting.
Yeah, and both of Didion's really one of the classics of modern journalism in a way that, Sontag also would be a similar era writer. I'm also reading at the moment, actually, but I'm coming back to all of these a lot. So yeah, there's that. And I was also looking at Jeff Lemire's Trillium recently, which I'm quite enjoying. I sometimes have problems because it seems like occasionally he goes exposition heavy in that way that I feel might be sort of a takeaway from him doing work at DC and sort of dumping the exposition from superhero comics.
Mm-hmm.
But mostly it's just a really daring sort of classic SF combined with his wonderful artwork and occasional experiment within the form where in certain parts you have to flip the book and it's following two characters at the same time. In a way, it's sort of like there are similarities between that and the people inside. Trillium doesn't go nearly as far poetically or and when it comes to the poetics of it or when it comes to the daring with the form, but it's a really interesting companion piece to it. And it's an interesting way of seeing those applications in a book that Vertigo would actually publish, as opposed to One Soul, which I think Vertigo today would not likely publish simply because I don't think that, I don't quite see that environment as conducive to creating pure auteur work. which this is. This is exactly that, and I'm so happy and so lucky. I feel so lucky that I had the chance to even read this. Like, it's a good time to be alive.
Yeah.
It is indeed. It's a good and interesting time, I will say.
Yes. Oh, yes, that too.
Have you read One Soul? Any of you guys?
No.
I have read bits. I actually have it right next to me, but I haven't read the entire thing.
Is it the same format?
It's the same format. It's the same format. It's more about reincarnation. And, well, not necessarily just reincarnation, but the connection between people in various timelines, I would say. Because I'm not sure if it tries to even spell anything out in that way, but it's fascinating. And it's a trilogy. There's going to be one more of these. I'm really excited. I have no idea what it's going to be about.
So, question: if you have it in front of you, one of the things I was curious about and that interested me was that like the big like transition scenes were from what seemed to be autumn going into winter, and I was curious if in One Soul it was from spring to summer or summer into fall. Is that true?
Just give me a second. I don't think so, but
It seemed like an interesting point to have that be the main transition here from fall into winter,
no,
and especially at the end.
there's
No, it's not.
no, it's not. There are transitions that feel sort of similar to it. There's one in particular in page 50. On pages 52 and 53 that use the similar angle for most of the characters to do something quite interesting. But and I mean page 52 to 53 in One Soul, not in the people inside. But
Yeah.
But yeah, nothing else I think.
Okay. Intriguing.
Nothing connected to that to the people inside like that.
I need to find myself a copy. We don't have it at the shop, and I looked at a couple of the other stores around, and I haven't been able to find it. And I'm loath to use Amazon when I don't have to. Locating a book. Interesting. All right. Well, I guess we can wrap up. Are there any sort of final thoughts that you guys have on this book?
I'm just glad that we picked a cartoonist's work to go over. Ales talked about a little bit about Jeff Lemire's work on Trillium, and I'm really excited to see people that have a grasp over the narrative and the language they employ. Also, their ability to put the pictures on the page and have it come together in one seamless form. For not being as familiar with Ray Fawkes' work and going into this with little expectations, I was blown away by the experience I walked away from. We talked a little bit about how everyone can relate on some level to what these emotions are that throughout everything. And I think before we went on the air, we were talking about a little bit, and Sam mentioned that no love is the same. How everyone has a different kind of love, and I thought that was a good point. But it also shows how similar love can be, and how just with time it can become something completely different. And I don't think that I've read a comic with as much emotion and truth behind it as this in a long time. The first one we did was Seconds, and that was a really, it was a really good look at adult relationships and not so adult relationships in the frame of Brian Lee O'Malley's artwork and story. But this just felt so honest and so raw that I'm really glad that Ales was on so we could pick this. So now I have an excuse to go find more books like this.
But you, Sam?
I loved it. I mean, I would highly recommend it. I think most of my thoughts I've said, but Thanks, Alice, for choosing this book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think. I mean, I loved the story. I loved the form of it. I will say I did find it a little bit sad, and a little bit tough to read at times. Not in terms of the intricacy of the storytelling itself, but more of just like the emotional impact of a lot of them. And well, I can't say that I sort of overtly relate to a good chunk of like the stories that are here. There's some that I can relate to a little bit more. I found it less to be a tale about love and death and more of a group of stories, all but one really, that was sort of about the degradation of love, and the emotional impact of when it falls apart, which isn't exactly what I was anticipating, but then I think in aggregate that is a big majority of what I got out of it, at least.
I think that's the beauty of it, though, is that everyone has their own personal viewpoint, and everyone has their set of experiences. And it's not like that it says a lot about a person and what they take of it, but I mean, it was about decay. You're right. It was about the decay of love in relationships, but at the same time, it was about how they change. Like maybe maybe the married couple doesn't have the passion that they used to, but their passion became something else. It became their family. And the same thing with the two girls, where the one girl was in the abusive relationship beforehand, and the other girl was in the relationship with the pop star. When they found each other, they still had trouble and they still had pain, but I mean, like I was saying, I think everyone can relate to this and describe their own meaning. And we were talking about Ryan Burton and how he did an interview for CBR. He was on our show. He's the writer of Dark Engine. He did an interview with Ray for this a few months ago, and they announced that it was coming out. And he asked, there are a lot of different experiences in here. Are there any ones that that you can relate to more personally? Then that's why you included them in here, whereas other ones were stories that you thought of. And he didn't want to talk about it because he didn't want to taint anyone. He didn't think that his personal experience were going to make the book better or worse. And I just kind of, that answer right there was just like, that's exactly what I took out of it, and I appreciated it a little bit more after hearing his response to that.
And how about you, Alice? What are your final thoughts?
By 0.
Volume 2, out today, in stores.
Yeah, but now it's in your hands. I've done the deed. I feel like I don't really have anything else to say. I feel like you nailed it when it comes to the fact that decay is also a part of it, and that the constant turning of things is a part of it, which that's the story of the leaves, because eventually both of those leaves fall down, and then they are both on the ground decaying together again, and then eventually they turn into the ground, and they decay with the water, and the water goes back up into the clouds, and the clouds go turn into rain, tree, leaves. Holy shit, we're there again. But it's that. It reminds me of the cycles of life, and of how being connected to them and seeing the world in all that it offers can be chosen. We choose the meaning that we give our world, I believe, and our universe, because I don't think that there's one objective meaning. And if that happens, maybe the one objective meaning is that there's no meaning, and you have to come up with your own. But I don't know. So what we end up with is just this work that I think, by the way we read it and by the way we talk about it, maybe says nothing about itself, but everything about us.
All right. Perfect note to end on. thank you all for joining us for the 4th episode of The Bleed with Ales Kot and Sam Morse.
Thank you.
I am David. That is Joe. And we'll see you next week. We have Mike Marici joining us from Hoax Hunters and his new book, The Roche Limit from Image. And we'll be talking about Black Science from Rick Remender and Matteo Scalera and Dean White's, which is a hell of a book. So, all right, gentlemen, it was a pleasure talking with you. We'll
Thank you.
see you later.
It was really nice meeting you, and I loved talking about the book.
Yeah, great. It was a pleasure. All right.